Hi, everybody, and welcome back to GS UK conference for 2025. We have Brian back again with us for another session today. So, what it means to measure IBM Z security. This is session ZQ, I believe. So
Yes.
please don't forget your feedback at the end of it. We do make use of it and we do try to use it for planning purposes. So I'll leave it to you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Okay. Just make sure you started the recording and everything. Maybe that happened.
It's all done automatically.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Then thank you, Sue, and good afternoon and good morning to everybody. I'm glad to see you, or in some cases, see you again. My name is Brian Hoogenbrook, and while I am a man of many hats in IBM. And I was wearing a completely different one when I spoke on Tuesday. Today, I'd like to talk to you from a perspective of a certification focal. This is a new role that really hadn't really existed inside of IBM infrastructure, to the point where last year most folks in IBM were still calling me that guy, uh, just because there wasn't really anybody who had kind of originated that kind of a concept of trying to look at these things a little bit holistically. But the whole goal here is to walk you through the state of certifications for security on the IBM Z platform. We'll talk a little bit about the whys of all of this. We'll talk about a little bit in the ways of definitions. We'll talk about a comprehensive view of what certifications actually look like for the stack and the products, and explain which ones we delve into. I'd like to be as flexible as possible when it comes to presenting. So if you have any questions in the middle of the presentation, feel free to throw them into the chat. I will be more than happy to pivot onto whatever topic you pick. Otherwise, I'm just going to start speaking, and you don't know when I'm going to be able to stop. So take that as you will. And for the record, this is a brand new presentation, completely original to GS UK. So it'll be fantastic to see if I can remember where all the jokes I put into it are actually located. So with that, let's show you a slide that I'm sure that you, as folks who've been around the IBM mainframe ecosystem, have seen in some capacity at some point, right? That slide that builds up and explains in as succinct a spot as possible all of the security features that we happen to have for the CPC du jour. Uh, so in my case, being originally from the ZVM space, I love to take the boxes with the orange stripes as my example, but you certainly see these for the IBM Z boxes as well, where they talk about the security capacities for processor and networking and hypervisors and all of the fantastic content that helps you manage security in the ecosystem. And somewhere on this slide, and it will always be on this slide, you're going to see 5 characters in a row, EAL5 plus. And that those 5 characters do an awful lot of heavy lifting for the amount of security that we throw at this machine. We do an awful lot in terms of actually certifying the box, and I'll explain it. So condensing it down to 5 characters is really a very neat trick. And I think it gets shortchanged a little bit by trying to condense it into that small of a space. It's actually a little bit misleading, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But you know, this slide, or the other variants of this slide, yes, it looks fantastic. It's great when it comes to selling. But being from the United States, we have a one of the states we have, one of the 50, is called Missouri, and they call that the Show Me State. And the quote that it comes from was in response to a congressman who the quote, I believe, is actually, "Frothy eloquence neither it convinces nor satisfies me. I'm from Missouri. You must show me." You know, IBM, you're making all these claims about the security of this box. We want you to prove it. is the net of it. And while we may throw, the AL5 plus moniker around quite a bit, that's only 5 characters. And if you don't understand what it means, then what have you really bought? Do you know what you've bought? So let me start by saying you don't actually have to take IBM's word for it. Those 5 characters are not actually from us. They are from an outside vendor and as part of a certification process. We undergo certifications up and down the IBM Z stack to make assurances to you, the end user, the system programmers, and the folks with the purse strings about the stability, the reliability, the security of the product that we happen to have. And there are a ton of standards out in the world, and their relative applicability can vary because some of them are aimed at actual business installations. Some of them are meant for, say, software processes. Some, like the common criteria, which we'll talk about quite a bit, are for product security and their mechanisms. And you even have certifications that apply to people. I've toted around the CISSP certification for about 15 years now because when I first started in the security space, I took over from somebody who was quite literally listed as Mr. ZVM on a lot of public-facing documents, and all of our customers didn't know me from a can of paint. So having some degree of certification, gave them some comfort that I wasn't just some weirdo who wandered in off the street to talk at conferences, right? So when I say that we've certified up and down the stack, I'm not joking. We do an awful lot of work by our hardware security modules, by the actual CPCs and the Prism partitioning functionality that's included at the base layer. Uh, we certify in a few different places regarding to virtualization, and we certify the operating systems, and that's true of ZOS. That's true of the various Linux distributions. We'll have a full breakdown of that coming. It's a lot to try to take in, and I think if you squint at this slide the right way, you'll see that it's actually a sailboat. And if you don't know what the acronyms mean, don't worry, we'll kind of break this apart and try to explain. There's an awful lot going on here, and it can seem like we're just doing things for kicks. That's KICKS, not the other kicks. But we've made a fairly, let's call it a intuitive path here and to try to get the maximum amount of certification for applicability for the platform. Whereas, if we had tried to certify, if we tried to certify every standard, we'd be here for quite a very long time. First of all, I wouldn't be able to fit this presentation within 45 minutes. That's for sure. And there are an awful lot of standards out in the world. There are more and more every day. No one has ever come up with that one presentation, that single gold standard that's going to apply to everything. And that's because every industry, every country, every academic institution, every business is going to have its own distinct requirements for security, for availability, for resiliency, and for auditing, for that matter. So the idea of a one size fits all certification is really never going to happen. And the closest we can get to is kind of what IBM is doing today. Now, let me pause for a second, just say that I'm using a couple words here, and I want to make sure that you understand the context in which I'm using them. When I say the standards, I mean those are the literal rules of law or the industry regulations. These are things that have been signed off and approved at a very formal basis to say this is the checklist of things to which you must adhere if you, for example, want to sell in this country or want to be a part of this industry. If I use the word compliance, that's do you adhere to the standards? And when you start to look at all the different standards, you're going to see that as different as they are, they have more in common than they don't. And when I use the term certification, I mean this is us proving our compliance to the standards. This is something that IBM cannot do by itself. We always get a third-party evaluator in to do the checking, the validation, go over all of the evidence and the piles of proof that IBM will provide, as well as gather up extra proof just to independently validate that IBM isn't talking out the side of its mouth with this stuff. And the certifications themselves are also backed by standards. So, I mean, if you had, just a random standard you you picked up off the street, it's may not be quite as interesting as one that is perhaps worldwide and recognized and understood to be of value. So, on that particularly busy slide, one of the standards that was recurring quite often is something called the common criteria. This is the largest certification that we do, and it's basically meant to assure security functionality for a given product, not a business, not a person, but a product. And it does so through two mechanisms. One is called the security target, and that is the claim. What do we say that this product can do? What do we say that Prism can be configured to meet? What do we say that ZOS can be tailored to protect? And that checklist is what the evaluators use to figure out, how good is this thing? This could be a standardized protection profile. That's a vetted checklist that's common across technologies that various certifying bodies have just kind of given the thumbs up to say, yes, this is good. We like this. Or you can have something called that's a more bespoke set of claims. If you look at Prism, for example, it's really hard to fit Prism into a very small box to say that Prism is just this. And so, Prism's checklist doesn't really look like anything else in the world. So we have to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of the sorts of proof and the levels of proof that we provide for it. Speaking of, the other thing that you'll see for the common criteria is something called the evaluation assurance level, the EAL number. And that this ties back to that EAL 5 plus you saw on that first sales-oriented slide. This is not a security rating. And for just to underscore that, let me say it again. This is not a security rating. What it is a measure of the pile of proof that we have given to back up the claim that we have made. So if you don't know what claim we've made, it doesn't really matter how big the number is. Uh, my cell phone here, I could try to claim it's an EAL7 doorstop. It functions extremely well as a doorstop, unless you take into consideration that I live in an older home and the doors aren't exactly flush with the floors, right? So maybe it would pass and maybe it wouldn't, but I don't know that I would spend millions of dollars to make that claim. You look at the claim for Prism, though, and you see that we put an awful lot of thought into what can Prism do, what are our intentions for it. And so when we say it's an EAL5 for all of these things that provide security for your benefit, you can say that we've really spent a lot of time trying to back that up. And not only that, but somebody else went out and checked it out for us just to make sure that we were telling the truth. Now, it is the common criteria that is the word that everybody's been using all this time. Um, a bit of history in the beginning. The common criteria recognition arrangement allowed those initial 26 participating countries to set a baseline for product security. And that was all very well and good when everybody agreed on the things that mattered. Um, and then the drama started. People started disagreeing. The U.S. federal space, they would actually prefer that you use a profile, a checklist that is standardized, right? So not the approach the Prism takes, but the approach that a lot of other IBM Z products take. So these things don't really have EAL numbers, but you have a very standardized set of claims that you can use for comparison purposes against other products. And it does mandate the inclusion of certain certified cryptographic algorithms, not necessarily FIPS validation, which we'll explain in a sec, but certainly the cryptanalysis that's associated with it. And the neat thing here is that you get on a NIAP approved products list if you use one of these particular sets of claims. Now, over on this side of the pond, uh, DORA and NIS2 have caused a fair amount of push for the EU to adopt something called the EUCC, a slightly different schema, which still has a focus on high assurance levels. They want you to provide that level of proof because some of these standards, to some extent, are looking for it. It's not that you can't get it in other ways, but that you might be setting yourself up for an awful lot of work if you don't go that route. So, and I'll point out that the EUCC and its member countries are also building up these approved products lists that are not necessarily, that are kind of follows on to any of the certification work that we do. So it's not necessarily that they don't recognize the approaches that they take, but if the goal is to get onto these approved products lists to be able to provide IBM Z technologies in all these different countries, uh, the common criteria has gotten less common, and that pushes us sometimes to do, in some cases, multiple evaluations against the same product. So when I talk about these evaluations, well, let me run down exactly what the heck is going on here. This is a product that's being scoped and measured. To some extent, this could be a subset of all the components inside the product. To say that it would be a misnomer to say that we evaluate every single thing that you could be doing in ZVM, for example. But we've delineated a particular software boundary. We've assessed the threats. We've made some degree of assumptions as whether or not we allow for malicious administrators to be a threat, or if we assume that the admin and their interns are reasonably competent and not prone to getting bought off by competitors, for example. We have to pick a particular level of code. Now, this is a fairly extensive and time-consuming process to do these evaluations, so we will do this 1 to 2 times per release per product, and the actual number of these will vary depending upon the product itself. The security posture that we take, and certainly a lot of the evidence gathering, the security testing that we do from Prism all the way up through the cloud, happens every single night against the code bases as they're being developed. But unless it's the actual level that we validated, we can't make an official claim. With an exception that that plus. Sometimes we tack on a few extra things onto the evaluation. One of those is usually something called flaw remediation. So if your evaluated version of ZOS, for example, in not that this ever happens, but if the worst should happen and we have to issue a second APAR, you could apply that service to ZOS without invalidating the security target that you've installed. Which is all well and good. You also have to configure things the quote unquote right way. We don't evaluate every possible configuration because, let's say, for example, you didn't feel like installing RACF or another security manager. First of all, shame on you. Second of all, um, when we look at this from a certification perspective, we feel if you care about security, then you're going to care about doing things the right way, right? So we're not going to make any claims about what ZOS or ZVM can do without RACF or what Linux could do without SE Linux because we don't want to envision a world where that happens, frankly. This configuration may be more or less stringent than your actual configuration back in your client shop. And there's going to be some degree of correlation to what one might find in a disastig or similar, but there's not an exact overlap. And I'll try to get to that toward the end. But the takeaway here is that we have one particular focal point for this evaluation where we focus all of our energy, and this winds up giving us something like the back of the Prism Planning Guide, Appendix B, which the last time I checked, for the Z16, I should say, was 11 pages in really, really small font that explained, here is everything you need to do to configure Prism to meet the terms of EAL5 plus. If you look at Prism, the goal is isolation and not sharing. Now, your machine could have any combination of isolated and non-isolated partitions, depending upon what you're doing, but the isolated ones are the ones that meet the terms of the common criteria. So, you're going to be looking into making adjustments so that, for example, when a resource is allocated to an LPAR, it's set to a reset state. You need to make sure that your security admin has done some work prior to the activation of partitions. That you've disabled dynamic sharing, that you need to separate the management network for the HMC. I'm not going to read every single one of these things, but you can see the bullet points starting to pile up. And I've made the font a little bit bigger than what you actually get inside of the Prism Planning Guide. So, first of all, you're welcome. Second of all, you're going to see that these requirements get a little bit more interesting as they go along because you may have environments such that, well, okay, maybe I do have hypersockets. Suddenly you're not in the AL5 plus configuration anymore. Or, if you had some case where your security logs were not being managed in a reasonable fashion, again, shame on you. But if you weren't doing that, or if you didn't have a recovery plan actually baked into the Prism evaluation, suddenly you're not in the exact same space as what we evaluated. And so we're not necessarily going to make a claim about the things that you're doing anymore. Not exactly. So the takeaway here is that we come up with an awful long list of restrictions, requirements, configuration points, because the goal for the common criteria is to prove the capacity for security. Mark Wilson I think, is running around this conference somewhere, and I'm sure he said the phrase most securable platform in the world at some point. If I've actually beat him to it, then I think I might owe him a beer. But if because the goal is to prove that securable nature, we are locking things down in a fashion that may not necessarily be in line with your business needs. You owning a shop, being under the gun for particular regulations means that you have to hit operational requirements, availability requirements, and you may not necessarily want to configure your system in an EAL5 plus certified fashion. So what we've given you is this is how you lock it down, and you can make a security decision based upon your business needs and understanding exactly what it is that you do want to do and what you do not want to do, and so that you can justify it to your security admins or to your C-suite. And so if I say that that original marketing slide that had the AL5 plus on it does an awful lot of heavy lifting. That is an awful lot to try to condense into 5 characters, isn't it? It's not to say that either isolated or non-isolated is bad, because I don't think they are, either of them. I think you just need to understand what it is that is actually being done so that you can make an informed and intelligent decision based upon the data and your tolerance for risk versus your requirements. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Not seeing anything in the chat, so either I'm doing a good job or my NPR style voice has managed to lull everyone to sleep. Looking forward to finding out which it is. The other evaluation we do is called FIPS. This is short for the U.S. Federal Information Processing Standards. Now, usually when people mention FIPS, they're talking about one standard, 140-3. FIPS itself is actually over 200 interlocking standards, and they deal almost completely with cryptographic implementation of hardware or software and a lot of the associated technologies around those, validation that you built AES GCM the right way, or that you're doing key destruction the right way, those kinds of things. And 140-3 is kind of the sum up version of everything, and the one that actually gets listed on the NIAP CMVP webpage in terms of validation certificates issued. It's a much smaller validation compared to the common criteria. You look at the cryptographic boundary of ZVM or ZOS, it's a whole lot smaller than the actual product. But in some ways, it's more intensive because you're getting into cryptanalysis, measuring of entropy, making sure that things are tamper resistant in the case of the Crypto Express adapters. And these things do dovetail in with the common criteria, which does have a few functional requirements for cryptographic integrity. The FIPS, it's worth noting, not unlike the common criteria, will actually expire after a certain amount of time. So, if the standards change, and they do, then some revalidation may actually reoccur for the product. So let me see if I can start putting that into pictures. I admit I'm more of a visual learner when it comes to looking at these things. So okay, here's the entire IBM Z stack. Okay, well, okay, not the whole thing, but I've tried to layer up as many different things as I could before we got to pure software, is the net of it. And so if you start looking at certifications, you'll see down at the bottom, not unlike that chart I showed you with everything that's currently active, the CACS adapters really we put through the ringer. They have the common criteria stuff. They have FIPS. They have PCI DSS, which the payment card industry's data security standard. We do work on PSI HSM down there, and we won't really talk much about PCI in this validation because we don't have that much time. But the net is you can kind of see that the further up the stack we go, there are some shifts in the way that we approach things. You'll see, Prism gets its EAL5. FIPS itself doesn't really apply to Prism, but CPAC-F, the on-chip crypto assist, gets included into an awful lot of other validations. ZVM at the hypervisor level actually does multiple common criteria evaluations because, surprise, surprise, we want to be on as many approved products lists as we possibly can. ZOS, same thing. KVM, not certified by itself, included as part of the Linux on Z distros. RACF actually has its own evaluation under ZOS. And that actually comes out as an EAL5. The ZOS team has done a fantastic job proving that RACF is solid as a rock. Not something that really ever happens elsewhere in the industry today, at least. In the case of ZVM, we have RACF. We assume its presence inside of the ZVM evaluation, and we don't do a standalone evaluation for it. Similarly, SE Linux in the Linux distros, automatically included, not validated separately. A quick note about Linux is that the recurring theme with Linux evaluations is that we do things in hand with the vendors. Three ones we work with directly: Red Hat, of course, SUSE, and Canonical, who make the Ubuntu distro. And the Linux distro approach to certification will actually vary based upon their own philosophies. So, but they all try to tackle a little bit of this stuff, and they work with IBM to try to make sure that everything is going to be okay. And they do that because they understand that IBM Z clientele are really looking for an awful lot of assurance that the stuff that they're going to run, especially if it came from the open source space, has undergone a fair amount of analysis. FIPS looks very similar, but I should say that I'll pick out a couple things here. Uh, we look at OCP, for example, Red Hat OpenShift Container Platform runs on RHCOS and not actually RHEL. So we could not really make a claim for the common criteria because RHEL and RHCOS are not the same operational environment, different packages, different code levels, but RHCOS could be including the FIPS validated packages that we do for the Linux space, which is perhaps a little bit more interesting to the container platforms than something like the common criteria would be. So it's depending upon where we are in the stack and the kinds of work that we do, we end up picking and choosing our battles to try to make sure that everything is going to be okay. And to some extent, these things fit together. You know, certainly there are some parts of the Z stack that will communicate with the Crypto Express adapters and have that communication path validated as part of the operational assessment for, in this case, a FIPS validation. CPAC-F included all over the place, even if we don't technically include Prism as a FIPS validated product, so to speak. CPAC-F is just kind of its own distinct thing, separate from Prism in that case. But the various crypto libraries in the FIPS space, again, much smaller than evaluating the whole product, will communicate to CPAC-F. They may talk amongst themselves in the case of ZOS. They may talk to the Crypto Express adapters, and we try out some of these paths to make sure that we have a FIPS validated context up and down the stack. Again, we're not validating every possible configuration that we could do. And I would certainly be interested to hear if there are configurations that need more focus. But picking and choosing our battles to make sure that individual crypto libraries have been put through the ringer and that to some extent they can interoperate seems to work out fairly well. Similar story for FIPS in the Linux One space. Again, Linux does these things on a per package basis. And because Linux is Linux, FIPS at least can migrate, kind of inherit some of the FIPS validations, assuming that they're using the right packages, which is a slightly nicer story than the common criteria. And I think technically this will be true for uh, OCP and OCP-Vert when that really becomes a thing on the platform. I know they're kind of in early days with the new version of RHOCP in that space, but I don't think we've made any official statements there yet. But you can see Linux, a lot more packages, still talking to CPAC-F. In the Linux case, certainly we have the options to talk to the crypto cards, quite a lot of them, honestly. It's just that they don't get bundled necessarily into direct communication with the crypto cards during the actual validation process. CPAC-F, yes. Not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it's understanding what we're doing that allows you to make more informed decisions, right? So I'm not sure if I'm earning myself a good name or a bad name as that guy inside of IBM, but asking a lot of questions has allowed me to draw some pretty interesting pictures. The next few slides do talk about these things on a per product level. And I should say that the Crypto Express adapters undergo quite a lot of evaluation. We don't usually list in progress per se, but in the case of KEX 8S, these things are listed out on public websites as being in progress. So we can actually say that, yes, for FIPS 140-3 for CCA, that work is under progress, and you can visit the CMVP website and see that on the IUT list. But the Crypto Express, the philosophy is that it's an HSM, so we really want to put that thing through the ringer. So I hear we found a number that's bigger than 16 lately in the IBM Z space. And I don't think I'm allowed to make any formal statements as opposed to what the IBM Z17 is going to look like in terms of certifications yet. But I think, at least for now, you can assume that those three rows beneath it say EAL 5 plus. I think you can expect that when the Z17 comes out, it should look very similar to that at the start. Now, with Prism, it's a little bit interesting that we actually certify twice, once for the water cooled and once for the air cooled. And we have an awful lot of things inside hiding out inside of that plus. We really focus on the isolation at the Prism level to make sure that this secure enclave that we talk up, whether it's in the ZOS context or confidential computing or hyperprotect, all is really driven and backed by that AAL 5 plus isolation that we are claiming. In the case of ZVM, we actually only certify every other release. That's because you can actually order one of two releases at any given time. So if you were stopped from buying ZVM 7.3 because we had no intentions of certifying it, then I have news. 7.4 came out in September of last year, and we are just completing. I may have pre-gamed that word completed up there for our EAL 4 Plus evaluation. We're just waiting on the final certificate now. The other things are still in progress, and FIPS 140-3 you'll see is still listed as a statement of direction. And that's because 140-3, due to the way that it landed in terms of when the cutover was going to happen between 140-2 and 140-3, and where we were in all of our product cycles, uh, it just kind of came at not a not a fantastic time, frankly. So you'll see that in the case of ZOS, we really weren't going to make any FIPS 140-2 validation claims in terms of ZOS. That's because everybody's busy looking at 140-3 and making sure that ZOS releases with a version number greater than 2 get access to the new good stuff. ZOS 2.5 has completed its OSPP, the NIAP version, and they're working on the other ones now. And I expect that in the very near future, we'll start incrementing this list to make sure that it's looking at the new cool stuff and that those kinds of things are visible. Linux, I'll very briefly try to summarize. If it's RHEL, they lean hard into the NIAP profiles and FIPS. If it's canonical, they will only do FIPS. They stopped doing common criteria, I want to say, back in 2018, and they never went back. And SLES kind of strikes a difference. They always do FIPS, and they'll flop back and forth in between doing the high assurance one and the NIAP version. And so the Linux distros, based upon where they sell and where they're running, have different objectives in terms of what they want to claim and how they want to prove things. But because a lot of these things are standardized checklists, you can actually make a fair comparison in between RHEL 9.0 and ZOS, strange as it sounds, because if nothing else, they have the NIAP OSPP and FIPS 140-N in common. So you can actually draw some correlations there, if not necessarily make a direct comparison about the technologies that back all these things up. Again, for Linux, FIPS validations are all on a per package basis, and those will vary based upon which distributor you end up using. So it's very interesting and a little hard to keep track of, and I'm hoping that I can keep coming back to various venues to make sure that folks understand that the Linux on Z and Linux One spaces do keep up to date, and we'll add new packages as we move along. So I know we only have a few minutes left, and I've tried to anticipate a couple different questions here. Now, those are two those are two certifications, and that was me talking for 40 minutes. Are there other standards? Oh, heck yeah, there are. Uh, will we do certifications to them? Uh, we'll take that under advisement. The common criteria we find is really fantastic for drawing comparisons and parallels. Whether you have IBM Z or the Z Security and Compliance Center or not, you can get a feel after reading some of this stuff that there are an awful lot of what we call crosswalks in between the various standards that if it applies over here, it's probably going to apply over there. And you can draw some correlations between does the common criteria back a set of claims that would apply to, say, uh, this regulation in Australia, for example. And the answer may well be yes, or it may be everything but one or two things, but IBM can provide proof of that. I will say that it would be cost prohibitive to certify every configuration of every build to every standard in the world. And for the record, and I'll say it here on the recording, the B in IBM stands for business. Eventually, we have to we have to stop cutting bait and start fishing. We have to ship a product. We can't just talk about how cool it is. So we have to weigh exactly what the benefit would be of doing any particular validation. Now, the for the record, this is example only. I really don't think that this is terribly accurate, but to give you a feel, you look at various standards. They may or may not overlap with the common criteria. I picked the DISA-STIG just for kicks. You look at actual clients' actual configurations. There may be some overlap there. Um, it's fantastic when things overlap. It's I don't think we're ever going to get to 100%. And that's because the common criteria is to some extent a thought exercise on how securable we could make something. The DISA-STIG, for example, is something that says, here's a good set of best practices, and actual configurations have to deal with the real world. And no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. And I get a fair amount of questions, being that guy, about whether or not, well, okay, is IBM Z SOC 2 compliant, for example, or does it comply to DORA? And I need to say that there are a fair number of requirements that either are meant for businesses and not for products, right? SOC 2 is not something we would evaluate Prism to. We would evaluate IBM to it. In the case of DORA, it's not really something that we can certify because, there are some business attestation requirements that the common criteria does some things for, but it also has a lot of HA and DR requirements, which are not really they're way bigger than any one product can do. And there are some technologies, AI and quantum come right to mind, that are moving very fast at the moment. And so the regulations are hopping right along too. Quantum safe, at least we have a stake in the ground for. I think 2032 is when everybody's kind of agreed, okay, that this is really, guys, come on, PQ2, it's coming along. Um, Other standards may just kind of sort of change, which is a little weird to think about, but these standards happen at the speed of government, right? If a if a political institution decides to shift one of its policies, then things can move a whole lot faster than we would like, and suddenly a nice to have becomes mandatory now. And part of that guy's job is to try to figure out how to get ahead of such things. I talked about the DISA-STIGs already. Again, really the goal is to, it's good to have a checklist. It's good to have something to talk through, especially because the common criteria does tend to be a little bit more theoretical. As the standards change, IBM's positions on all of these things may actually shift. And so we may have to weigh whether or not we go NIAP versus EUCC or continue to pay for both. Do we give focus to one approved products list or another? Do we want to keep doing EAL4 or EAL5 or any of those things? What kind of rug pulls are we going to hit with the adjustment of HIPS 140-3? And how is quantum going to apply to 140-3? It's all shifting more rapidly than, frankly, I would like. And it's coming fast. And there are, as I mentioned, some technologies that are less of a product and more of a lifestyle choice. Pervasive encryption is one. Uh, Platform resiliency is another. Confidential computing, yet another one. If you look at confidential computing and secure execution for Linux, that's actually several products walking around together inside of a trench coat. They are, it is a security philosophy that's backed by hardware and fantastic to use, but it is so new that there's no actual standard to certify it to. So we at IBM need to figure out, if you want to trust this technology, do you need something to back that up? And I'm afraid that brings me to the end of my prepared remarks, just as the buzzer is sounding. So I'm going to leave this slide up just for a sec while I take a drink of water and see if anybody is going to throw any questions into the chat.
You have all been unmuted, so feel free. Anybody has any questions? No.
Well, it's I guess the answer is I used my NPR voice and I lulled them all to sleep. But when they watch the replay, they'll understand. IBM does an awful lot of work in this space, and it's not marketing. It's not enough, and it's never one and done. We have to keep coming back to all this. Um, should you think of something later, you can talk to that guy at IBM, who's more than willing to answer your questions on certifications across the board. And I appreciate your feedback on this one, especially because this is a brand new presentation bespoke for GS UK. And so I am wildly open to feedback on how to improve it, unless that feedback is stop talking. There's not a whole lot I can do about that. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for taking the time to come out. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and I hope to hear from you all soon.
Thank you, Brian. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And have a good one.